Welcome, Robert.
Thank you so much, Josephine.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too.
When we met a couple of months ago, you explained that you were working and had been working with USAID for approximately 10 years?
Correct.
Yeah. What was your position there?
So I did work for 10 years at USAID as a project management specialist in charge of environment, natural resources, and climate change. But also at the time of closure, I was the team lead for the environment, climate, and engineering unit. And also I did serve as the climate integration lead for USAID.
What did your work involve?
Two key things, two or three. The first is that I was charged with the responsibility to design climate change and biodiversity conservation projects, but two, oversee the implementation of those projects in the country. And three, I did mention I had another role of climate integration lead, charged with the responsibility of supporting all the other sectors of USAID, all the other investments of USAID, to be able to analyze, assess the climate risks to those investments and plan for, risk management strategies and mainstream them across those other sectors.
What did implementation of what you're just telling me now look like on the ground?
So once the projects were designed, we then awarded contracts to organizations, charged them with the responsibility to implement those projects. And the common thing was that these would be big international organizations who would then partner with the local organizations, either as partners, or subcontractors, local organizations, civil society, private sector partners, who would then directly engage with the beneficiaries. But also there were opportunities to, sometimes directly award some of the funding to government agencies, what we called G2G, government to government awards. Those presented other opportunities for implementation. Then those would directly engage with the beneficiaries to implement the designed activities.
So you were working with governments, with private sector NGOs, who would then work with the communities.
Exactly.
How involved were the communities, or how were the communities coming into this?
So on the ground, these communities, I'll use one or two project examples. One was a climate smart agriculture project that I was overseeing. So the communities would be organized, say, in form of farmer groups or farmer cooperatives, who would then be approached by these organizations and be taught how to implement climate smart agricultural practices. That's one example. The other, I'll use the biodiversity conservation example. Forestry activities, for example, protection of forestry, how we would engage the communities. There was one example of, engaging communities in securing the boundaries of central forest reserves. You would engage these private sector companies to make the concrete pillars, carry them to the sites, and then hand them over to local leaders and communities. In a participatory way, the community members would then show the survey teams, where the boundaries are. They agree in a participatory manner and plant the boundary pillars, to protect the forest reserves. So,
which areas in Uganda were you heavily engaged in?
Again, I'll continue to use those two project examples. The agriculture one was called the Enhancing Resilient and Adaptive Agricultural Livelihoods, implemented by the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture and the National Agricultural Research Organization, NARO. And the focus was mainly the dry cattle corridor. And then the biodiversity conservation project was called the Biodiversity for Resilience activity, implemented by RTI International. And the main focus was highly biodiverse landscapes in the country. These included the Kidepo landscape and the Central Forest Reserve surrounding the national park, included the Lake Mburo National Park, included Makshon Falls National Park, and other selected Central Forest Reserves like Budongo and Kalinzu. And I'm using these two as examples of projects that I was overseeing directly.
Do you miss the work?
I really miss the work because I'm very passionate about biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation. So yes, I miss the work.
What do you miss the most?
Especially, that private sector engagement component. It wasn't something very common. I was excited about it. We had begun to engage the private sector and, encourage them to invest in biodiversity conservation, especially things that made business sense to them. And they were beginning to come on board. And it's really sad that we stopped where we had reached.
So everything just shut down?
Everything just shut down. We woke up one day and then we're told, hey, look, there are stop work orders. Now that means immediately stop what you're doing. Pens down.
I saw things like that on different social media platforms, but I'd like to actually understand that they actually happened in that way. So Robert, you're sitting in your office.
Yeah.
And then someone walks to you or an email comes through. What happened?
Yeah. So it was mainly through emails. That's the official agency communication channel. You're being told, hey, look, let all your implementing partners know that they have been asked to stop working. And then the stop work orders came for each of those implementing partners.
But you would had an inkling that something like this was going to happen.
Yeah, but then we didn't expect it to be as drastic as it happened. And the clue arose from what the past was. If you may recall, during President Trump's first term in office, our climate funding was actually zeroed out at that time. But then, it wasn't that drastic. We were still allowed to use the monies that we already had, to proceed and complete smoothly what we had been doing. But this time it was so drastic. Whatever had been midway had to stop where it was. Nothing was allowed to proceed. That's how bad it was.
And I'm selfishly asking this question around climate.
Yeah.
But if you who is passionate about adaptation, mitigation, and the environment, biodiversity, and so on, you're sitting there and thinking, what does this mean for Uganda?
Yeah, of course, for the country, so many implications. So many implications right from household and community level, and then upwards to the government institutions and to the economy in general. And looking at the communities who are the very first level of beneficiaries. If you've, for example, been supporting them to adapt to the impacts of climate change, you've been supporting them to be able to still continue to produce their food crops and be able to earn an income. And then suddenly you have these investments stopped. That means you're directly affecting their ability to produce food, their ability to earn an income from their farming activities. But this has implications for the higher levels, for the economy. The economy largely depends on agriculture, on farming. So that means there's a possible impact on the economy. To the government institutions, we've been building their capacities to be able to also respond to some of these climate-related impacts. But now, midway, we have to stop this kind of capacity-building activities. That means their own ability to deliver on their mandate and be able to respond to climate change, their capacities are affected. Yeah.
I think people are more empathetic when it's the health sector that's affected, or education, or something.
Yeah.
But when it's climate, there's still all of this, we don't believe it anyway. So, that was money being wasted.
Yeah.
What goes through your mind?
So I think there was a misconception, especially amongst those other sectors, because climate change is a general development challenge, not climate, as a standalone. Because climate change affects all those other development sectors, be it health, be it education, be it water, be it, energy industry, biodiversity itself. And so to think that climate change, is not an issue for them is actually self-deception. And this is why I told you that as part of my work, what we're trying to do was to support those other sectors. So that's why we chose to take that mainstreaming approach, support those other sectors, to use a climate lens, screen their work, and be able to see and know that climate change actually affects their sectors also. And so by doing those climate risk analysis, we were showing those sectors that, hey, look, you also actually need to plan for and budget for climate action within your own sector.
When I hear that you are working with the private sector, I always ask myself, when they stopped the funding and immediately said, put your pens down, like you said, and you had to reach out to your implementing partners, some of who are the private sector and other donor agencies. Did they also just put their pens down?
Yeah, they had to do that for the components that we were funding using US government money. Pens down, tools down. But allow me clarify this. Why we were choosing to engage with the private sector. Reason is that if something makes business sense for the private sector, then chances are high that they are likely to sustain those investments even when they don't have US government money.
I thought so.
Yeah, and so it was strategic on our side. We put in some little money to catalyze private sector investment. But believe me, and I'll use one example. So we managed to attract Porini safaris, game watchers from Kenya. We put in about $200,000 to support an investment worth about $1 million. And Porini would be putting in about $800,000 to support the development of a community conservancy around the Kidepo National Park, an area called Lopej or Kawalakol. Now, to allow the coexistence of livestock and wildlife and tourism-related activities, borrowing the models from the Masai Mara. And one strategy to build resilience to climate change is to diversify. If the livestock sector is not performing well because of the changing weather and climatic conditions, then hey, look, the pastoralists have an option. And so we brought in this partner. But believe me, because it makes business sense, even when we've phased out, this business partner, this private sector partner is continuing to engage with the cattle keepers around Kidepo to continue to build and develop this investment, just like the Maasais are doing in Kenya and Tanzania.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me about why you would then engage private sector.
Yeah.
So where we saw things fall apart totally was not all with the private sector.
Yeah, where the investments were purely dependent on U.S. government funding, those were heavily affected. And this explains why we kept also encouraging government to also make sure that, government is beginning to plan for and budget for some of these kind of investments and say, hey, look, who knows? As a sustainability strategy, we continue to encourage government also to put in investments in the kind of work that we are doing so that if we phased out in future, of course, we didn't know there was going to be this sudden cut, but there were those kind of sustainability strategies, engaging with the government also, encouraging them to put in budgetary allocations to this kind of works that we're doing, so that even when we phased out, there's kind of continuity. And we hope that those strategies are helping.
Continuing.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense that the person you're working with has a stake in this because then they want to project it.
Yeah, correct.
Doesn't that say something about how we should start thinking that this is how we work with going forward?
Of course, going forward, and this is a key message to our other development partners, but also government itself, that indeed, as part of our sustainability strategies, even when we have a development partner, it's very important, to build those kind of sustainability strategies into the designs of any new programs. Make sure government is, putting in some kind of co-financing initially, engage with the private sector, engage directly with the communities. Even though we don't quantify in monetary terms what community contributions are, they're usually so big. They contribute the land, they contribute the labor, they contribute the ideas. These are big contributions. Yeah.
So my boss likes to say on the project that we work on that you don't get into a partnership without seeing your way out. That people must know that this is ours to maintain, when these guys are not here.
Correct.
Would you have any story that would help us understand how the communities are faring now that you've stepped away?
So, of course, I haven't gone back to the communities yet, since we had the stop work orders in January. The stop work orders meant we couldn't even travel to get back to the communities we worked with. And so I may not have readily available response to that question. But my expectation is that especially for those interventions where we had built community capacity to do things themselves and things that they were seeing direct benefit from the works that we had taught them to do, they should be continuing to implement those. And I'll use one example. One other example. So we did support NARO through the IITA, the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture, to develop the new drought-tolerant and disease-resistant coffee varieties known as KR1 up to 10. And believe me, Josephine, if you went out to the market now, you would find those varieties. They are coming from the investments we made earlier. And because one approach we were taking was we didn't want to distribute these seedlings free of charge, from the labs and then to the greenhouses, and we didn't want to distribute them free of charge.
Free of charge means
free
waste.
of charge, chances are very high that you're not going to sustain those kind of investments. But also because we wanted to engage the youth in agriculture as a business, create employment opportunities for them. We pushed for a model that, organized youth groups would then be trained by NARO and given startup, mother gardens, taught how to, pot the seedlings, multiply them, and sell, do business.
All this stuff.
Yes. So in the project districts, I'll use one project district which I just visited before the closure of USAID. That was in Tungamo. I visited a young man who had just got out of university, based in a sub-county called Chibasi. He had left the city and said, hey, I found a business opportunity back home. His father gave him a little piece of land, and he's one of the main suppliers now of the new varieties of coffee seedlings. The other is a farmer in another sub-county in Tungamo. I visited him just before the closure, called Namara James in Tungamo. This farmer, I think this year, should be able to make over 60 million Uganda shillings from the sale of coffee seedlings. He's receiving buyers from all over the southwestern part of the country, So business model that works out, even when we phase out, somebody's making money, is doing it as a business. Okay, yeah.
Did your phone stop ringing, or are there some of the teams you're working with, or?
Yeah, even right now, this as I came into the waiting room here, some of the phone calls still keep coming in. Say, hey, are you there? We're still asking about this. Can we still continue to? But then, the stop work order, the farmer may not understand what exactly that meant.
It just feels like you abandoned them.
No, but the good thing is that, so when you take a trainer of trainers model, then there's always somebody on ground.
There's a bit of continuity.
There's a bit of continuity. Like these farmers that we did train and build the capacity for them to keep producing these climate smart technologies, they still continue to. But also, having worked through the government institutions, we're able to say, hey, look, check with NARO. NARO will continue to exist even without US government funding. Yeah.
So I'm sure I know the answer to this one, but just to check, is the funding now at totally zero, or did it just dramatically reduce?
So I'll respond to that question based on the portfolio I managed, the climate and biodiversity conservation portfolio. So the funding is zeroed out.
Wow.
Yeah.
What do you see as the long-term effects of this zero funding?
So, again, this depends on if there's somebody else possibly picking up from where we stopped.
Is there anyone picking up?
So, again, since January, I've not been able to, for example, participate in development partners meetings because the rule of the game was that as staff, we were no longer allowed to continue to participate in some of those meetings to represent the US government on those meetings. So on the development partners side, I can't tell very clearly if there's somebody picking up from where we stopped. But my expectation is that especially the government partners like NARO, like the Wildlife Authority, like the National Forestry Authority, the other ministries we engaged with, like MAIF, we kept encouraging them to, include budgetary provisions in their next, annual plans and budgets for the kind of work that we had been doing together. So the chances are likely that, yes, there's continuity, especially for government. But to answer your first question, if what the kind of impact long term would be like if nobody picked up. Obviously, it would be adverse impact in terms of food security for our population. Adverse impact in terms of water supplies. Adverse impact in terms of health, because we were making lots of investments in the health sector, climate-related ones through our mainstreaming work, or even direct investments like indoor residual spraying and, So the long-term impact goes beyond the day-to-day livelihoods, but to the overall well-being of the people and of course, adverse implications for general development and the economy in general. Yeah.
I recently interviewed someone who was sharing their own experience. They were speaking of the silence that followed. They had applied for a grant. They'd gone, a couple of steps and then just silence.
Yeah.
And for them, out of all of this is the clear understanding that we need to stop heavily relying on donor funding and governments need to step up and private sector needs to step up. What are your thoughts?
I totally agree with their thinking. I think that's the way to go. This was a big lesson for us. But as I did mention to you, we'd already been through our own projects, been encouraging that, hey, look, let's try to have the private sector come into this kind of work that we do. Especially look out for those components that make business sense to the private sector. But also for the government to begin stepping up, increasing their portion of investment in some of these works, some of these investments. I purely agree with their thinking that let's stop depending on development partners 100%. By the time of closure, actually, we had begun to build the capacity of local organizations to take lead in the kind of works that we were doing.
Yeah.
You will notice that, for example, in the health sector, most of the monies were now beginning to go to local organizations. We were taking a localization approach. Rather than engage the big US companies to come and implement the contracts here, we were beginning to award the contracts to local organizations, build their capacity to begin to do that kind of work. And that's the way to go. Build the capacity. And in the climate change space, additionally, what we are doing through our projects, we are also building the human resource capacity. Yeah, so you don't have to bring experts from elsewhere to respond to, climate change in Uganda. One example is that project I talked about with the IITA. So we were funding about 18 PhDs and MSCs,
So many acronyms.
Yeah, sorry?
So many acronyms.
The IITA, the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture, that project with IITA and NARO. I think NARO is much more familiar.
You can't assume that everybody...
And the National Agricultural Research Organization. And then, so through that program, we are supporting so many master's and PhD programs in climate research and science, so that we could build, that local capacity, the human resource that the country needs to respond to climate change being a new science, but also the new MSc climate change at Makerere University. We supported the development of that program so that locally here, many more scientists can venture into climate science for us to be able to build the much needed human resource capacity to respond. Yeah. So correct, building our own internal capacities and less dependence on donor support is the way to go.
When I listen to you speaking, and even from our previous conversation, what I get is that part of your job was to make sure that USAID funded projects were being implemented efficiently.
Correct.
Right? And that the money wasn't being wasted. But then there's this whole USAID is inefficient propaganda machine. All of this that was going out and how the money was being spent and all of the receipts that people are pulling out.
Yeah.
Was that hurtful for you?
Of course, that was so hurting. Having been internally there, it's easy for people who are not within the system themselves to make such comments. But the truth is, so USAID had these very strong checks and balances internally to control against any kind of fraud, waste, and abuse, right from project design, inbuilt systems, And then we also had the U.S. Inspector General of Government based here for USAID activities, for USAID projects, full-time watchdog. So the internal systems against any kind of fraud, waste, and abuse provided for, reporting, investigation, and even termination where any kind of fraud, waste, and abuse had been found. And believe me, Josephine, even for my own projects that I oversaw, I don't want to mention company names here, but I'm aware of companies whose contracts were terminated because of detected, where fraud, waste, and abuse was detected. It would be embarrassing for me to mention. There are about 3 local companies whose contracts were terminated.
And your overview of USAID and its systems is Ugandan-based?
So these are global requirements for the entire agency. Yeah, systems inbuilt into how the agency does things. And we had to do that also for Uganda. Yeah.
So you said since January is when you received the
stop work orders. Yeah.
What have you been doing since January? Am I allowed to ask that question?
Should be fine.
All right. What have you been doing since January up to June when you were then said, when you know that this is over and done with?
Yeah. So to close projects is a very lengthy process. Actually, more than the 6 months that we were given. It's so lengthy to close a project. There are lots of assets on ground. There are a number of contractors on ground. So many things that are incomplete. So many things. If I'm to tell you the things that stayed halfway incomplete, you wouldn't believe it. You have equipment on ground. You have to work with the implementing partners to develop asset disposition plans. You have to evaluate how much they need to be compensated so far for how much work they're delivered on ground. You have to calculate staff benefits. So many staff are going to lose their jobs, but, there are so many different provisions in their contracts that you have to review and be able to determine how much they need to be paid, Yeah, so closure processes, reviewing some of those claims and making sure they're rightfully paid for.
In my head, Robert, the stop work order meant put your pens down, go home.
Yeah, but then somebody has to be paid. And also, you're not just going to leave government equipment on ground. You have to bring them back either to Kampala or identify, whom you should deposit this to. You need to transfer, work with the Ministry of Works and Transport, if it's a vehicle, to transfer ownership from the U.S. government name.
So there's a lot of operational work?
Lots of operational works, financial related and, other. Yeah.
What would you like us to know about all of this, how it's played out, how we should perceive it?
I think from my previous submissions, I've said a lot about how it played out. it all happened so fast, so drastic. We possibly weren't able to do certain things like we would have wished to do them, smooth handover and smooth transition. That would have been our wish. But we tried our best during the available time, engaged with our partners, especially the government partners and other development partners who would wish to pick up from where we stopped. We provided the documentation, but also did the transitions, to the other U.S. government agencies, provided all the information. If somebody would wish to pick up from where we stopped, the State Department is still in place. They can approach State Department and pick it up from there. And especially for the donor community, the development partners. For the works that stopped midway, those present low-hanging fruits, opportunities for them to pick up from there. I'll give you examples of construction works. A building stops midway.
Yeah.
You want to pick it up from there, complete the structure, and then...
So when you pull away, when USAID pulls away and there's this building midway, they just...
That is exactly where the construction work stops.
There's a guy
Clear
I saw that
examples
was just
exist.
walking through empty construction sites and saying, yep, this is where they left this. And I kept thinking, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's what stop work orders meant. If, you're doing construction, that is where you stop. So clear examples, you'll find them when you go to Kidepo National Park. We are doing lots of construction works there. 3 new ranger outposts for rangers to increase their deployment, to conserve the landscape. Lots of water supply schemes, stream crossings across the park. Everything stopped where it was. And so that's how I'm saying these present low-hanging fruits not only for the development partners, but also for government, the Wildlife Authority, the Forestry Authority. For the Forestry Authority, we were constructing. So we had just completed the designs and, the environmental assessments for the first ever canopy walk in Uganda for Kalinzu, and possibly the third in Africa. One in Rwanda, one in Ghana, also previously supported by USAID. About a 2 million investment that had to stop where we had. And so the canopy walk and visitor center, those present low-hanging fruits for the private sector. NFA to engage with the private sector, for tourists to come from all over the world to this, be able to do chimp trekking over a canopy walk. And the aim is that if communities can realize the benefits from such an investment, then they'll protect the forest reserve, and then, it continues to sequester carbon. Yeah.
I have 2 more questions for you and then I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
What keeps you awake now?
So right now, for me, I look at the positive side of it. One, the closure presents an opportunity for me to get back to my own work, private work, but also family time. Many times I've kept away from family for so long, for so many years. Lots of travel, but also I had been an absentee farmer. The things we teach other people to do,
yes.
Climate smart and new coffee varieties. So on my own farm, absentee farmer, things are not working out so well. So I'm looking at it positively, using part of the time to do that. So it's keeping me awake. But 2, at the time of closure, I was picking a lot of interest in climate finance. So I'm doing a lot of reading, a lot of discussion with the professors and others in the climate finance space. I'm one of those people that believe that, to respond to climate change internally within our country, we don't have to all the time look at foreign funding. So trying to, do research and explore those opportunities for domestic climate financing. It's an area of interest for me. It keeps me awake, Josephine.
My next question was going to say what gives you hope, but then I feel like
I think I've answered that.
You're good.
Yeah, especially through, if we took the mainstreaming approach, these resources we already have for all these other sectors. Support these sectors to be able to do climate risk analysis on an annual basis. Okay? The health sector, for example, should be able to identify climate risks to the health sector. Pick part of the budgetary provisions on an annual basis and say, hey, look, we can actually use these resources. Same applies to all the other sectors. And I think that's the way to go. It will reduce dependence on foreign sources of climate financing.